So this whole race thing is bigger than God, right? I mean, God couldn't have foreseen this. This is more than God can handle, right? Then do you believe that? If you don't, then why do Christians sound like non-Christians when we talk about racial issues? Why do we sound any different? What is wrong with us? Or is it possible that we're not hearing what God really wants us to do right now? So those are your options, really. Either this is bigger than God, and so we humans can figure it out better than he can, or maybe we've not really been attuned to what the Bible, to what our faith has to say on these issues. So you can make your decision. I'm going to choose the latter. And if that's true, then let's look at what God has to say. Now, a little bit about myself. I'm a Christian and I'm a scholar. And I have this belief that good science and good theology matches up. So usually if something is good theologically, we'll find it in the sciences. Now, that doesn't mean that science and religion always agrees, because sometimes you have very poor theology, sometimes you have very poor science, and I've seen both, okay? I've seen the sausage being made in sciences, and I've also seen really bad theology. We know that hundreds of years ago, bad theology says, I couldn't talk to you all because of my race, right? So we know there's bad theology out there, we know there's bad science out there. So I'm not only going to talk about the scriptures, but I'm also going to look at some research as well, because I think the approach that what we see from the Bible is an approach that really is substantiated by what we know academically. And maybe some of the studies I'm about to talk to you about you never even heard of. So does Christianity have anything unique to offer about race, or do we just sound like everyone else? All right, first let's just go to the background. We live in a racialized society. And that is a society, that's a society where race matters profoundly for differences in life expectancies, life opportunities, and social relationships. Basically, this says race matters. That our race has an impact on how we are going to experience our lives. In our relationships, in our opportunities, in our experiences. And our race matters whether you're an African American like myself, or whether you're white, or Latinx, or Asian. In other words, simply because you're white does not mean your race matters. In fact, it does matter. It matters in ways perhaps you don't see, but it matters. We live in a racialized society. There are societies that are not that racialized. That's not the United States. Their difference is not based upon what we consider a race, and I won't go all into that. But that's not the United States. We live in a racialized society. So how do we handle this racialized society? Because we know that part of the reason why it's racialized is because of the centuries of racial abuse. Well, there's two contrasting views. And Kirk is right, there's more than two, but to simplify it, there's two contrasting views about racism that I want to discuss. First view is this, that racism is something that is overt and only done from one individual to another individual. In other words, if I mistreat you because of your race, that is racism. And it's overt. It's like saying, well, I'm not going to hire you because you're Latino, or I'm not going to hire you because that's racism. That's one view of racism. It's the idea of, the KKK, that's racism. Another view of racism, though, is that racism is structural as well as individualistic, and social structures can, and it's too early in the morning, perpetuate racism even when individuals do not intend to be racist. So it's not just when I mistreat you because of your race, is that we have social structures that perpetuate racism. And you don't even have to be racist. Now, I'll give you a historical, obvious example of this. And a lot of people with this view will say it's also here contemporarily, even though it's not quite as obvious. But Jim Crow laws. Do y'all know what Jim Crow laws were? Were separate but equal, black only, white only signs. I know you all have seen pictures of that. That is structural racism. It doesn't matter whether you are personally racist or not. You live in Jim Crow times, that works to the disadvantage of people of color. All right, two views of racism. Now, the reason why I want to point this out is the way we're discussing racism breaks down a lot on these views, a lot. Let's look at two major manifestations of this today. And go ahead and go to the next one. Black Lives Matter, and next picture. Black Lives Matter. So that's one manifestation of what we see on how, that's the second view. That is institutional, that is structural, not just about the individual. And a lot of the protests, when you listen to the protesters, they're not necessarily saying that's about personal racism. They use certain terms that may obfuscate a little bit, but it's not about personal racism, it's about social structures. And in response to Black Lives Matter, we had All Lives Matters. People say, no, all lives matter, not just Black lives, all lives matter. We should punish overt racism, but we don't need to deal with these sort of social structures. And this is the argument we're having today. The argument that has emerged today. Okay. So let's look at both of these, one at a time, and let's look at whether or not these are methods that are really a good way to look at racism. And let me just say something. Christians have largely fallen either into a Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. And when we listen to Christians talk, by golly, they don't sound any different from people who are not Christians, talking about Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matters. Now, there are times where a Christian should sound exactly the same as everyone else. When it's 2 + 2 = 4, there's no Christian take on that. When we're talking about a moral issue such as racism, it seems to me we should be sounding something different. So let's look at each of these approaches. First, All Lives Matters. Next slide, please. All Lives Matter lead. Before I do that, I'm sorry, I forgot to put this in here because I want to illustrate something. When I mentioned to you about how Christians sound like everyone else, this is just a representation of some research. If you look at common American beliefs, and you look at the difference between whites and non-whites on racial issues, that's in the whole country. Okay, so that whites and non-whites have different ideas on racial issues. Most notably, whites are more likely to be at an All Lives Matter approach, or non-whites are at a Black Lives Matter approach. Now that's the way it is in the country. The whites and non-whites disagree. But then we had a research looking at just Christians. And to illustrate what happens, this is what happens. That on racial issues, among Christians, whites and non-whites are even further apart than in the rest of the country. In other words, white Christians are even more invested in an All Lives Matter approach than whites in general. Christians of color are even more invested in the Black Lives Matter approach. Folks. So when I say that we sound like the rest of the world, we're even worse. We're even more invested than everyone else. Okay, now I'll go back. Let's look at All Lives Matters. All Lives Matter is tied to something that scholars call white identity. And to understand white identity, that we tend to have an identity developed through our racial social identity, and that leads to certain values. It doesn't mean that all whites have these values any more than all blacks are good at basketball. I've played some on the court. Some of them really stink. Every now and then you get a white guy who actually knows how to play. So, that happens. But there's just these tendencies. For example, individualism. Individualism is the notion that what we do as an individual is what contributes to our success. So that if I work hard, I become successful. If you don't work hard, you don't become successful. Individualism is a trait we find more among European Americans than people of color. It makes sense in a society where European Americans have more economic, educational advantages to feel good about your success, to feel more like you as an individual succeeded. Another aspect is being comfortable in society. When we do surveys, we find that whites are more likely to see our society as fair than non-whites. Whites are more likely to be content to not make major changes than non-whites. Whites are more comfortable in our society than non-whites are. Once again, given the position whites have in our society, this makes sense as being connected to a white racial identity. And then this third one, color blindness. And this goes back to all lives matter approach, right? That we should ignore racial differences. All lives matter, ignore racial differences, let's be colorblind. Colorblindness is the path to go. So these are tied to this notion of all lives matter. The last one especially. So let's look at what research says about the last one. Is colorblindness viable? Can we just ignore race and then just move on as if everything's okay? All right, first bit of research. There's no real differences in racial discrimination when it comes to hiring over the past 25 years. And this was done off of what we call a meta-analysis, which just means they looked at the results of many studies and put it together. It's complicated. Take your graduate level stats class, and then we'll go more into that. But I'm just saying that this is done with a lot of different studies. No real difference. You know, the notion that, well, you know, it was bad back in the by and by, but now we've gotten better. Well, for the past 25 years, that's not the case when it comes to discrimination. A lot of these studies were done with what we call audit studies, where you send in an applicant that's from an African American or a Hispanic American, and then from a white, and then they see the callbacks, and they find that the whites are getting more callbacks. So colorblind, right? Next one. Have you all heard of driving while black? It means you're more likely to be pulled over if you're an African American driving, and the stats back that up. I mean, they've looked at sections of highways, and they look at the number of the racial makeup of the people driving, and they look at who gets pulled over more often. And what multiple studies have shown is that if you're an African American, you're more likely to be pulled over. It's called driving while black. It's not a myth. It actually is a factor. And of course, if you're pulled over more, you're more likely to be caught with something, more likely to go to jail or penalized. Just a really brief anecdote in my own personal life. When I was 17, I was pulled over by the cops because I was doing a newspaper route. And they were just checking me out. They were just checking out, saw I was a newspaper route, it was really early in the morning. I was like, and later on I thought, well, if I was a criminal, I'd been caught. But if they did it because I was driving while black, I was a criminal, I was white, I would not have been caught. I'm not saying this is the only thing that counts for the differences between blacks and whites in prisons, but it's a factor. But colorblind. How about this? Resident segregation still impacts educational outcomes for people of color. When we segregate by race, and resident segregation has not really decreased that much for the past 10, 20, 30 years. We send people to different schools. I don't know how St. Louis is, but I reckon that they have black schools, mostly blacks, and white schools, mostly whites. And we know that schools of color don't tend to have the resources of other schools. And so it has an impact on your education. I actually went to a school that's mostly Latino. Just happened to be that way. There's other schools that are mostly white. I was fortunate to go to college because out of my graduating class, I went to a very local nearby school. Only 2 other people went to college at that particular school. I'm sure some went to the other schools. I met a lot of students from the white schools who were going to my college. My high school focused in on industrial arts, building houses, not preparing kids for school. So resident segregation still has this impact. And finally, there's evidence of racism in the beliefs and practices of medical healthcare providers. Once again, this was done with a meta-analysis. I believe like 26 out of 37 studies showed that there was racist beliefs in their or practices in healthcare. And if you ever want to know what racism has to do with healthcare, Google Tuskegee syphilis experiment and go back and look at that. I won't go all into that. And I know that's a long time ago, but it just shows how our race can impact our healthcare delivery. But colorblind. So is colorblind viable? A viable way in which we can approach dealing with race today? Can we just ignore, these racial impacts and just say that was in the past, but now we're all good? Research says no. And research would suggest that this is not a way in which we can deal with our racial issues. Well, what about the all lives matter approach? What about that one? Well, let's look at that. Now, you may have seen this term a bit, anti-racism. Have you all heard the term anti-racism? Can I see the hands of those who have? Okay, so most of y'all have heard this term anti-racism. Let me just unpack what that is a little bit for you. It's proactive in approach. In other words, it doesn't just say, hey, you know, when we find racism, we're going to deal with it. No, we're going to be very proactive in dealing with racism. We're going to address it very aggressively as we deal with racism. It focuses on unfair advantages or privileges of being white. There's a concept known as white privilege that you may or may not have heard of. It focuses in some of the studies I just showed you on how whites don't have to deal with some of that stuff. So it focuses on that. It says, this is not fair. We have to deal with this. It talks about implicit bias as far as hidden racism. And there's been this body of research trying to look at implicit bias on how racism is hidden, and maybe this explains things such as why people of color don't get callbacks on job applications. If you ask them directly, no, I'm not racist, but there's this sort of unconscious bias that is there. Taking action to dismantle all aspects of racism. So it's not just being placid. Take action, dismantle. I mean, we all hear about some of these protests, these rallies, dismantling racism, dismantling the structural racism, looking for institutional racism. Some have talked about ending whiteness, and what that means could vary. Some have talked about how white identity has contributed to some of the racism, how it perpetuates racism, how it works to the advantage of European Americans. And so we must end whiteness, and what is a healthy white racial identity is not affirming whiteness, but affirming others. And so that's a concept that comes out, And if you've heard of, the newest book, #1 in Amazon, last I checked, was called White Fragility. That was a book talking about how to end whiteness in a sense. That was a big part of it. And so that is something that's emerged from this anti-racism. It's not just dealing with racism, it's also, ending this notion of whiteness. And finally, there's talk about listening to people of color rather than trying to take over. White fragility is really big on just listening and affirming people of color, and whites not entering into the conversation at all. That the job of whites is to listen and affirm people of color and allow people of color to take the lead in dismantling racism. So this is an approach that's been emerging, and a lot of people are running to it as far as how do we deal with these racial issues. So the question we should ask, and the question I have to ask as a scholar is this approach successful? Well, what does the research have to say about it? First, tests of implicit bias are very flawed. One thing that they can't do, what they've been trying to do is to say, all right, we have implicit bias, and once again, this, I'll be happy to take questions if someone has, how they try to test for this. But, we have these tests and we show implicit bias. Does this match with increased prejudice? And they can't make this connection. So it may be that we have this implicit bias, but it's not resulting in us actually being prejudiced to one another, which really means that how bad is implicit bias if it doesn't really impact you? I mean, in our society, if people are around you and they have this bias towards you, but they don't act differently towards you, are you really being impacted by that? Maybe you sense implicit bias, maybe it makes you feel bad. But really, is that all we're really trying, is this a source of racism in our society? And so, one must be skeptical when such tests don't show that they actually lead to prejudice. And then, have you all heard of diversity training? You do diversity training in all different ways, a lot of different diversity training, and you do it when you get a job or you have to get promoted. I think once a year I have to go through some sort of diversity training where at my job, it's online, stuff like that. When they've done research on diversity training, they've had a lot of diversity training, and you know what they find? That it might change your attitude like 5 minutes after you're done, and then later on, it's back down to normal. In other words, it does not have any sort of lasting effect, it appears. There might be some techniques that do, who knows, but overall, the sort of training people are talking about, the sort of training people are saying that we need in anti-racism isn't really making any sort of real changes. And then this. I said, white privilege, there's a lot of talk about privilege, and there's a lot of talk about talking about privilege and teaching people about privilege and teaching people about the unfair advantages of whites. And here's what they found. A researcher found this is very fascinating. So what she did was, she and her team surveyed people after they'd learned about privilege and those who had a different lesson. And what they found was that their attitudes towards people of color did not change. If you were dismissive of the class of people of color before the training, you still were afterwards. If you were supportive before, you weren't any more supportive afterwards. But the attitude towards poor whites changed. And people who are more progressive or liberal, as they saw it, actually became more hostile to poor whites because they realized you had all these privileges and yet you're still poor. So is it possible that this sort of anti-racism approach, instead of making us more aware and more sensitive to people of color, it actually makes us more dismissive of poor whites? So is this approach successful? Science says no. Okay, so we've seen both approaches, and remember, my contention, and you can correct me if you think that I'm off on this, my contention is Christians sound like, either they sound all lives matter or Black Lives Matter. We're not any different. And so we're buying into these failures because we just sound like everyone else. So what truth both approaches lack? And now I want to get into Scripture. You say, all right, we're Christians. What is all this? What truth both approaches lack? And it's this. Human depravity. Both approaches do not take into account, or they take into account in a limited sense. Like they look at the human depravity of whites, or sometimes look at the human depravity of maybe of people of color, maybe they're demanding too much. But they don't take into consideration that human depravity knows no race. So I want to go to the concept of human depravity, and what would that mean when we dealt with racial issues? And I'm going to propose something that's neither one of these first two approaches, which I think is Christian-based, but also I can support academically, because remember, I'm a scholar too. Christian and a scholar. I got to have both. I believe they match up. All right, scriptural backing for human depravity. I'll just go through these verses, and I think there's a concept that y'all probably are familiar with, but I'll just go through these verses showing that, I'm not just making this up. When we look at Genesis 6:5, the Lord said that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of thought of his heart was only evil continually. That sounds pretty depraved. That we have this evil that's continuing in our heart. Now we know Christ has come, to take that burden off of us, but our natural state, we have this sort of evil that is there. Romans 3:10-11, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. 1 Corinthians 2:14, the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are folly to him, and he is not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. And there's other verses. There are other verses. The notion, there's an argument among some intellectuals, are we naturally good or are we naturally bad? And to say we have human depravity doesn't mean that we're bad all the time in every single way, but it says, no, we don't head towards natural goodness. The Enlightenment thinkers, those who developed the Enlightenment movement, thought we were naturally good and that we would be perfectible. And that attitude has come across among many people in academia and some of the cultural elites, that we are perfectible. So what does it mean? Human perfectibility versus human depravity. Please go to the next slide. There's a notion of human perfectibility that we can perfect, we can create. And if you notice, both approaches are kind of doing the same thing. They're both saying, hey, we just do this, we'll perfect, we'll ignore race and we'll have this perfection. Or we'll have anti-racism and we'll teach people to be anti-racist and then we'll have perfection. Well, what does that mean? Human perfectibility. Human perfectibility, that humans will become better with education. We just educate them correctly. Educate humans correctly, and then things will be good. There's actually some interesting research by a colleague of mine who looked at education and what people actually did. And with more education, you actually got people more likely to say that they would send their kids to schools that are racially diverse. Well, I think they just said whites. Send the kids more racially diverse, live in racially diverse neighborhoods. When you actually look at what they actually did, we looked at what people with more education actually did is they send their kids to less diverse schools and live in less diverse neighborhoods. This is after controlling for things such as income and region and things of this nature. So education, call me skeptical. Humans are rational, and this rationality can be, we can be convinced, we can rationally convince people to be better, because humans ultimately are rational creatures, and we can convince them. And then the last one, if our position, Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, is taken, then we can end racial alienation. It's sort of like we can have peace in our time. We'll just defeat everyone who disagrees with us. Everyone who agrees with us, we have peace in our time. And so human perfectibility versus human depravity. Human depravity does not have these sort of assumptions. Human depravity is that people are inherently selfish, and that cannot be taken away with education. They say you educate someone who's immoral, you just have an educated immoral person. That our selfishness does not go away with education. In fact, one of the conclusions my friend had in this is that what education does is it helps you to learn how to gin the test we use to measure your racism. So when you ask about racism, you say no. I passed this test, but then you figure out society and you put your kids in schools that are not diverse. Only by accounting for our desires to protect our self-interest. And this leads to a theory called group conflict theory, which is an academic theory. And that's how we deal with group conflict. In other words, if I recognize that I'm trying to protect my interests as an African American as I interact with other people, that's the only way in which we're going to deal with group conflict, is just to be honest. Hey, I have a certain amount of depravity. That is there. And then only holding each other accountable can we find solutions for racial alienation. If we are all depraved, then no one of us has all the answers, because we're all going to look at answers that best meet our needs. But if we can hold each other accountable, so we can find a common answer that we can agree upon, this is the implication of human depravity. Do I trust European Americans to find the best solution for race in our society? For me, no, because of human depravity. Do European Americans trust me to find the best solution for race in our society? No, because of human depravity. We have to hold each other accountable. And if you believe in perfectibility, then maybe you don't. You can find the perfect way. You can say, hey, everyone needs to do this. But if you believe in human depravity, you're skeptical. And I'm skeptical. And so I've had what I consider a mutual obligations approach. A mutual obligations approach. So this is the third path. And I say it's a Christian-based approach because it's based on human depravity. Now, I can present this in front of a non-Christian audience and never use a scripture verse, because there are theories and evidence out there, and I'll show you some of it that shows that this can work and should work. In fact, we know it works in other contexts. We just not tried it in our racial context. A Christian-based approach, which recognizes that people of all races have a nature that have a sin nature that has to be accounted for. Thus, everyone has an obligation to work towards healthy interracial communication to solve racial problems. So the obligation for everyone is to work towards healthy race relations. The solution may not have an equal obligation for everyone. Given our history of racial abuse, we may have a solution that, we treat certain races differently. But to get there, we all have an obligation to have an honest interracial communication with each other and to solve the problems together. I mean, in some ways it sounds so simple in comparison to the other approaches, which is sort of, we're going to impose our solution on you. But are we truly doing that? Now, once again, as a scholar, I have to ask, is there empirical work that suggests that this can work? Or have we seen it work in certain contexts? We're not seeing it used in a racial context that much, but is there other contexts? And so let's look at some empirical work on healthy interracial relationships. First thing we know is that under the right conditions, interracial contact alleviates bias. Under the right conditions. There are conditions in which it doesn't. But under the right conditions, if we have contact with one another, our bias towards one another tends to decrease and maybe even go away. And we've seen this again and again and again. This is, I don't think it's even argued in academia anymore that interracial contact alleviates bias under the right conditions. Now, one of those conditions is having a common group identity. It increases positive feelings. In other words, if I feel us and them, then it's easier for me to feel anxiety towards them, fear towards them, anger towards them. But if I feel it's us, and yeah, you're kind of us a little bit, but maybe a little bit different, but you're still us, my negative feelings start going away. And what's been happening in our society? Are we going us and us, or are we going us and them today? What do you see in the news? Are you all keeping up with the news? What do you see? Do you see us and us, or do you see us and them? And so why am I skeptical that our approach that we're doing right today is going to deal with racial issues in an honest way? And the research says, when there's this common identity, why in the church have we not used our common identity as Christians to really deal with some of these issues? We have to ask some hard questions for ourselves as well. This is interesting research, that families with a collaborative orientation have more positive interactions and relations with each other. So they look at families, and they look at those with what they call a collaborative orientation, which, when problems come up, they collaborate to work together, versus those that do not. And what they find is they have more positive feelings towards each other. Do we want to find a racial solution where our side wins, and then the other side is just angry at us and sabotages us? Because that's the direction we're heading right now in our society. Whether all lives matter or Black Lives Matter wins is almost doesn't matter. I don't want to say it that way because of course it has serious implications, but almost doesn't matter. Because whoever wins, large groups of Americans are going to spend their time sabotaging their efforts. Yes. And then collaborative communication creates an atmosphere of mutual support. And that creates voluntary volitional compliance. Do we want solutions where 40% of the country want to sabotage us? Because that's where we're heading. Or do we want to find solutions where we collaborate and people choose to work towards a solution that we've agreed upon? In other words, working together actually, we know from research, actually works towards creating unity, towards creating a positive, collaborative, volitional choice to solve the problems that are there. And so this is what I call a mutual obligations approach. Now, I'm going to just quickly go through this last, because I look at my time, and I know from teaching college that this is the time where students are struggling to keep up because there's been a lot of material. So I'm going to just kind of go quickly through two implications of mutual accountability. First, institutional processes, and then second, looking at interpersonal relationships. So let's talk about this. First, this first one, interpersonal processes. Go ahead. Here's what I would propose if we have a problem, let's say we have let's look at the whole problem with police and community. How we try to solve this with the mutual accountability approach? First, define the racial problem. So, we can't solve everything at once. Let's define this problem. Second, identify the critical core. What do we have in common? Because let's try to develop that common group identity. Let's try to say, all right, we disagree, but here's what we do have in common. Third, recognize the critical cultural or racial difference at play. So we're not going to just paper over our differences. We're going to, say, okay, here's where we're different. Here's our disagreements. Here's the problems we have. Let's recognize that as well. Then develop ideas that address the concerns of those in the other group. So if I know what your concern is, and I have ideas on how to solve this problem, my ideas should at least make an attempt to address your concerns. I don't have to worry about addressing my concerns. I'm going to do that when I present an idea. But now, remember, as Christians, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to consider others as worthy as ourselves. I need to have my ideas that address your concerns as well. And then work towards a solution that can be accepted by all. Now, sometimes when I present this, some people will say, well, I don't want to work with those folks. They don't ever, want to agree with anything. And maybe they've had bad experiences. I suspect some people, though, are really saying, I don't want to give in to them. I want to get everything. So the choice is this, and this is the choice that reality gives you. This is not a choice that I'm giving you. This is, the choice God gives you is, you could get 80% of what you want, because I think the compromises are really going to be that. It's not going to, you have to give up everything. It's not going to be 50-50. You're going to get 80% of what you want, probably, maybe 70%, and have everyone work towards your solution succeeding. Or you can go for it, and maybe you'll win politically. Maybe you'll get that 100% written into law, and you'll watch people pull down statues, or you'll watch people sabotage affirmative action programs. So that's the choice. And how sustainable is it to get everything you want and then have 40% of your country come at you again and again and again and again and again? Or you get 80% and have that sustainable. That's the choice that you have. So that's how we try to solve larger problems. But there is an interpersonal, interracial relationship piece to it, and I want to be clear about this. First, good interracial relationships does not ignore institutional issues. And I say this because there are some who say, well, if we just learn how to get along with each other, that solves everything. No, that's an important piece. I'm saying that has been neglected to some degree by those in the anti-racism school. But it does not address institutional problems. I mean, there has to be intentionality to eventually address those issues as well. We can learn how to relate to others with these relationships, though. So I do think that the interpersonal relationships is important, the interracial relationships is important, because it teaches us how to relate to others. And in them, we must take chances to veer into controversial issues. You can have people of different races as your friends, and they're your friends. You go out and you go out and you worship together, and you may play sports together, or you may go to parties together, or you may watch TV together, whatever you do, and you never talk about racial issues because it's too controversial. So, in fact, sometimes we have people of different races as friends, and it's a good cover for us, right? So you have to be willing to go into these controversial issues. So let me give you, a personal application with a concept known as active listening. And this is a way to sort of practice so that you can get into these controversial issues, so that you learn how to deal with people of different races. So the next time there's a controversy, you know how to talk to folks in ways that they can listen to you. All right, and I do active listening a bit when I do my research, because I do interviews as well as other types of research. And my interviews, I did a book on atheists, and that book was based on interviews I did with atheists. I'm not an atheist, so I have to learn how to actively listen to atheists so that I can figure out, my research questions: why you're an atheist, what's the stage as an atheist, things of this nature. All right, so first, find someone that you disagree greatly on racial issues. If you don't know someone you disagree with, then develop friendships, expand your friendship network. Have lunch or coffee with them. Listen to their perspective. Ask them about these issues and listen. Listen to their perspective. Talk to them till they're satisfied you understand their perspective. In other words, the way you do this is, when they tell you their perspective, you then reiterate it in your own words, not clone their comments, in your own words. Is this what you mean? And when they say, yes, that's what I mean, that's how I feel about this, then you can move on until you've gained a total understanding of their perspective. If they're willing to listen to you, fine. If not, let it go. Do not come at this with, okay, we're going to both do this. Because that person didn't ask, that person didn't agree to actively listen to you. You're going to actively listen to them. And it'd be great if they say, how do you feel about it? And they mimic what you just did. That'd be great, but don't go in there with that expectation. Finally, do not feel obligated to agree with them. Some people think we go and if we don't say that, we don't challenge them right there, that means we're in agreement. No, it means you're trying to understand. I once had this person ask me, can you do this in social media? And I said no, because social media is out there in public, and people sort of have to show their position. Now, there are ways you can do it on social media, but I don't advise social media. This is something that has to be done personally. And when you're in one-on-one situation, you don't have to, confront them and say, well, you're just wrong on this. In fact, if you say you're just wrong on this, you're not actively listening. You're listening to understand, not to argue, not to debate. Now, why do this? What does this exercise accomplish? And this will be my last slide, so after this, I can open up to questions. It helps us learn the perspective of others. Helps learn the perspective of others. When I listen to people talk about racial issues, which I do a lot of on media today, I can listen to people and I know this person's never listened to someone who they disagree with, because the concepts they use. For example, when I hear a person who's white who says, well, I don't see race, I know that person's never listened to a lot of people of color who do see race, who know race has impacted us. I can't get away from being black. It is who I am. Is it the most important thing? No, but it is who I am. It's a part of who I am. So I know right then and there that person has not listened to other people who have a different perspective. Likewise, when I hear people just throw out white supremacy like it's nothing. Now, you can make that an academic meaning. You can say, well, we really don't mean the Klan. But you say white supremacy, people put the Klan in their heads. And if that's what you mean, then you've not listened to people of other perspectives as well. We don't know how to talk to each other because we've not even listened to one another. Helps us learn how to actively listen, which could be a good practice not only just in race relations, but in life. Hopefully all you'll get married and hopefully you'll learn how to actually listen then. Some better than others, obviously. But it is a skill that's worth having. It's worth having in race relations, and I think it's worth having in general. Prepares us to communicate with others when the next racial crisis occurs. It'll prepare us to listen to others. It'll prepare us to know how to communicate with them. People won't make the mistakes I just mentioned as far as using terms that excite the people that already agree with you and alienate everyone else. There's I guess one thing is, do you want to feel like you're right, or do you want to really get something done? Because you can use these terms, all lives matter, you can feel you're right, and then you don't get anything done because you've turned off people. You've not listened to what all lives matters means to them. So do you want to feel right, or do you want to get something done? And then they could create a larger atmosphere that promotes useful interracial communication. You know what my goal is, ultimate goal in doing this. And it's going to take a long time. It took us a long time to get this state of society to where racial discrimination was seen as a moral bad. Believe me, when I was a kid, it was not necessarily seen as a moral bad. Yeah, you didn't want to do it, but if it happened, it wasn't really seen as that horrible of a thing. Today, it's seen as a horrible thing to be a racist. I like for us to get to this point in society where it's seen as a bad thing not to be willing to listen to others, not be willing to engage. Now, you all are going to be part of the leadership of the church, at some point, 10, 20 years from now. And of course, I'm not, just us isn't going to be able to do it. But if more and more people like us begin to prioritize interracial communication over, we win, we get all we want, then that could change the atmosphere of our society. And so, we can do it one person at a time, impact people as we go along, encouraging this sort of active listening, communication, deal with our own human depravity, rather than what we call win-lose solutions, where I win, you lose. Instead of looking for win-win solutions where we both win. Okay, that's all I have. So I want to open it up for questions, and I don't know how you want to do this, but I'm open.
Yeah, why don't we, I've got a question that I'll start off with. Ooh, my mic's loud. But of course, we'll get plenty of time for Q&A here. So here's a question that I'll start off with, and I can take this off, and I'm a little further away. So as someone who's studied this issue, you see the different views and approaches. And there's the book you mentioned, White Fragility, one of the most popular books on that. Certain terms are defined in such a way that prevent someone like myself from questioning some of the arguments or the analytical side of things because of where I come from, according to the author.
Yeah.
How am I, as a Christian, able then to have a real connection, a mutual approach here, if because of where I come from, I can't even have a seat at the table unless I agree with certain terms and assumptions.
Yeah. The book White Fragility, and yeah, you're right. It was still maybe number one in Amazon.
And maybe we need to explain this a little bit further about what white fragility is.
Right. The author basically makes the argument in White Fragility that really the role of whites is to not only have to listen but almost agree. And if you do anything other than that, you're engaged in white fragility. So if you disagree, you're in white fragility. If you cry, you're in white fragility. If you ignore the person, you're in white fragility. So it really is a book set up not to promote communication. It's obviously not based. The author is a sociologist, and I'm pretty sure is not a Christian, so has no need to base it in the Christian notion of human depravity. And that leads to the problem of white fragility, because if really done, if you really did this, and you can already see examples of this, you really put white people in a position to be verbally abused. Because no matter what the person says, you have to affirm it. If I was a white person, I would say, I'm out. As an African American, I'm saying I'm out, but especially not because people of color are more abusive than others, it's that we're just as human as anyone else. And so someone with the mentality of white fragility is not open to this at all. And we have to start with people who are open to having honest communications. I'm going to come out with a blog tomorrow where I'm going to critique white fragility and endorse mutual accountability. And so I'll come out with a blog tomorrow. But yeah, and I would also say that there are problems with that book beyond just the general idea. I find the science of it pretty troubling. And one of the things I point out on my blog is that I think that she's sloppy in some of the things. For example, She says that 100% of the presidency from the years 2016 and 2017 were white. Well, actually, that's not true. Obama was president in 2016, for all of 2016. In fact, for 20 days in 2017. So, so there's just a sloppiness to the book that also, I think, because it's, and the sloppiness reveals sort of biases the author has. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I think if someone is steeped into that and not willing to budge from that, it's just like if you're witnessing to someone who simply does not want to, they're not going to accept Christ no matter what at this point in their life, and so you move on to the people who are open to it. Let's work with the people who are open to having this honest communication. Other ones we'll have to bring along at later dates. I think that's the only thing I can suggest on that.
Let me ask a second question, then we'll open it up here. How can we as Christians get people more sympathetic to the colorblindness model to see the injustice of police brutality?
Yeah. One thing I've, speaking for a long time on racial issues is when you learn how people connect, you can talk to them in ways that they can hear you. And of course, no one's 100% on this. I have a friend who teaches sociology at a Christian college. And what he found was that if he just slides a bunch of stats, his mostly white students just sort of say, okay. When he starts also putting verses into it and talking about biblical justice and what does it mean and does a little Bible study with it, they become more open. And that's just a matter of learning your audience. One thing when I talk on this more is, I'll just throw this out, If you think that we could just ignore race and that doesn't have an ongoing impact, let me tell you some research I just did. And I said this a few years ago. It's a little dated, but I think it's still applicable. That I studied, our willingness to date outside of our race. And I found out that among white Christians, there was more willingness to date people of a different faith than of a different race. That usually gets people attention. And, the reason why I use that is I've talked to enough white Christians to know what gets their attention and what doesn't get their attention. Well, if we want to convince people, we want to change people's perspectives, we have to start talking to them and understanding where they're coming from. And that is the way. And so if we just come at it from what we think is convincing to us, and if I say this and use white supremacy and say, hey, do you want, you're engaged in white supremacy, that is not an effective strategy I've found among white Christians. Learning how people can be approached on terms that they can understand is a much better strategy to use. So.
Great. All right. Well, why don't we open it up to questions? And I'm going to walk around with the microphone for this session here so we can all hear the questions nice and clearly.
So at the beginning of your talk, you talked about how we are a racialized society. So in your studies, have you ever found an example of a society which was racially diverse but did not become a racialized society where that race became a huge issue and something that was constantly talked about and or fought over?
Yeah, you can look at, say, someplace like England, which is, we think of England, they're all white. No, they're not all white. And they're not really racialized the way we are. So you think of England and some of the European countries are that way. And there's a reason, and you can look at Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, for a variety of reasons, did not become as racialized as we did, even though when you go to Puerto Rico, you'll find people very light-skinned, people very dark-skinned there. So, we're actually, now, I say this, I'm careful to say this because we import a lot of our culture around the world, and so we sort of racialize other parts of the world. But us in South Africa are two very racialized societies. Not to say there is a conflict based on other things. Israel is based on Jews and Muslims and other. But as far as being racialized, us and South Africa are the two very most racialized societies there are.
All right, I'm working through this, so it's probably a muddled question. But I feel such tremendous guilt and frustration with the white church. When a couple of days ago, a presenter showed pictures of Emmett Till and just how the leaders in white churches for the last 200 years have continued institutionalizing racism and racist rhetoric. And one thing that was interesting to me, I didn't see you call for any sort of repentance from white people or from the white church. And I'm curious, I guess I just feel it in my gut. I want us all to come and apologize and ask for forgiveness. Is that a part of how we move forward, or is it not?
I think it's going to be, and I used to talk about that much more overtly, but I've come to, and so I'm a believer that there's that in the notion of corporate repentance, and that there's a value to it. But one thing I want to emphasize more at this point is the communication aspect. I think if we communicate, we'll get to that. But I think if I put that up front and say this is what it has to do, then there's going to be resistance to that in a way. I think it's something that I appreciate where you're coming from, and stuff like that is very, very important for us. But I think the emphasis has to be on how do we get there in this sort of communication, and so I'm pushing less on here's what the solution needs to look like, because I have my idea what the solution should be. I clearly I do. And I'm sort of downplaying that more so than I ever have before, because more and more I've become convinced that, even if I am correct, even though I'm that one person who actually has the 100% solution, if I come and say, here's the solution, folks, just the act of doing that is going to resistance, and it will not be a solution that's implemented with enthusiasm by, 75% of our group. And so, I hope that answers your question. That I know of what you're talking about, but there's a reason why I'm not pushing it at this point, because I think that the process is important. And the process, I think, will find other things that have to be done as well. So hopefully in the conversation that will be brought out, and then, we can, in a healthy dialogue, those sort of issues will be brought out that we can really fully adjudicate.
Like today, especially on social media, there's a lot of talk about cancel culture, and a lot of YouTubers and celebrities, people that are in the public eye, a lot of their past things that they've said or done are being brought up with the racial issue, and they're getting canceled. Do you think that's something that's productive or helpful to what's going on right now, or is that something that's more hurtful than helpful?
Great question on cancel culture. Cancel culture, what is the purpose of cancel culture? Cancel culture really fits into the human perfectibility model in this way. If you can be perfect, why aren't you? And so if you fall short on something that is decided that we shouldn't have, such as racism, it is appropriate to punish you as an example to others so that they can attain perfectibility. Given that, cancel culture is not something that we should endorse as Christians. Now, that does not mean that someone who, obviously, for example, if I'll just use this as an example. I know of a church that has a man who's married to the church secretary. He, I think 30 years ago, engaged in some degree of pedophilia. And now cancel culture says, okay, what's he doing at a church, right? He's around kids. They have protocols. So to not have cancel culture doesn't mean that you just ignore everything. They have protocols. He's never to be alone with a kid, and he has to meet with people. but the church accepts him because he's been forgiven by God, so who are we not to forgive him? So it's not that you just ignore the problems. If there's potential problems like that, of course, you take in the protocols, the right protocols, but we don't cast people out like they're rubbish. That's secular ideology. That's not Christian based. Now, as a scholar, what's cancel culture do? What we've seen in the research is if you have a collaborative, if you work together, you can actually bring people together. But if people are living in fear because they're going to be canceled, how collaborative that's going to be? How honest can I be? If, here's my honest opinion. Well, that's racist. You're canceled. What does that do with communication? I mean, there's not been a lot of research on cancel culture because it's kind of a new phenomenon in a lot of ways. But I can't see how research would come out that wouldn't show how pernicious of an effect cancel culture has on our ability to have communication with one another. I just don't see how that would not be the case. So yeah, obviously I'm not a fan of cancel culture. And then I'll just leave with this. I don't want to be known for the worst thing I ever did in my life. I don't want that to, how do you know Dr. Yancey? Well, this is the worst thing he ever did in his life. That's how we know Dr. Yancey. Y'all are pretty young, so maybe y'all could survive that. Most people who get to my age have done something that they're not very proud of in their past life. I think, grace means that we are, we're not the worst thing we ever did in our lives. And if we're Christians, that's what we believe, and that's what we do. And so yeah, I've been a big opponent of cancel culture. I think that it is something that's very deadly to our ability to have a healthy society. And I hope as Christians we speak out against it. And speak out against it even when we can use it to further our goals. There's some over here.
So you mentioned that diversity training has little long-term effects. So with the situation with the police brutality and how it comes up a lot, how do you think, since diversity training doesn't really have any long-term effects, how do you think the police should be, reformed in a way that they can have less of that bias?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not a criminologist, and so I don't know what research has said on what helped to correct police brutality. I've heard conflicting things on whether body cams help or not. Cameras on the body so you can actually see what is happening. I wonder if there are ways in which we can observe the interactions more. I would have to really look at the research to really have what I would feel are comfortable, good ideas on what. I have read somewhere once that they used to do implicit bias training on police, and they still do. And they find that has no effect, and which makes sense because implicit bias, we know that implicit bias is not connected to, or we've failed to find evidence that's connected to prejudice. So, dealing with implicit bias is not what is. So anyways, yeah, it's not my area, so best I can do.
My question is in a similar vein. I really appreciate that you're approaching this with saying, let's ask questions, let's have an open dialogue. And so I'm just curious to hear your personal opinions on knowing that there are certain things that do work, such as sending your child to a diverse school, things like that. Do you have certain solutions that come to mind as far as whether it's diversifying neighborhoods, diversifying schools, funding schools of color, diversifying boardrooms, diversifying, all of those things. What are your thoughts on just some ideas of solutions, big picture? I know that's a very vague question, but.
Yeah, there's actually some research that shows that when it comes to diversity, that one of the places that surprisingly has done a good job is the military. And in the military, there's a book called All You Can Be that really outlines this argument. And I'm probably favorable to this argument that what you do in the military is they don't just say, hey, all right, we're going to diversify, we're going to throw people in there. The military takes people from all walks of life, they train them so they bring them up to the same level. So, you're not taking some kid from the barrio who doesn't understand English very well and say, all right, you're in competition with everyone else. You train them to bring them up to level, and then they allow for competition. And what they found when they do that, they get diversity. And because of the nature of the military, if you are I have a brother who was a first sergeant. He retired recently. So if you're a first sergeant, we know what you're capable of, because all first sergeants are capable of this. If you're a lieutenant, we know what you're capable of. All lieutenants are capable of this. And so, to me, if we were to do that in society, what it would mean is, having very intensive programs to equalize the capacities of people across racial groups, and then allowing them to compete. To me, that seems like the best way to try to diversify, as far as I can see. I'm open to others, if I see other research, but All You Can Be by Moscow and Butler is a book that talks about this approach.
I've got another question about the history of the Christian church with race relations. When I think of the abolitionist movement and the history of the Methodist Church, particularly with desegregation, what you see happened over history, and correct me if I'm wrong, was while things opened up legally, and as the church sort of opened their own borders, so to speak, you still witnessed a tendency for, as the old adage goes, birds of a feather flock together. Mm-hmm. So what relationship is there, I think, between skin color and cultural differences? At least I see some of the cultural differences as the underlying reasons for not even communing together on a Sunday morning, because the way the white Methodists would do church is different than the way some of the black Methodists would do church. And for that reason, they remained separate, even if in spirit there wasn't the tension.
Yeah, there's a lot of complications to that, obviously. What happened in the Methodist churches early on, there was segregation, and then some of these cultural differences were allowed to really intensify. So the cultural differences are there, but how much of that is due to our historical racial racism and that sort of thing. A lot of my early research was on multiracial churches, and so for the black church, a lot of the black church, the church was the source of cultural power, of protest, of things of this nature, and so so you got that element to it. Obviously churches would be more diverse if we didn't have some of the barriers that we have. Some of that they would be more diverse, but there would still be some churches that are mostly. And then you have to think about the immigrants. When immigrants come to church, they're not going to be. They're usually not immediately comfortable in a church that does not have a lot of immigrants in there. And so, if you're talking about the Latinx population, there's going to be immigrant churches for the Latinx population, and then there's research on second generation and what we call 1.5 people who came here as kids, as immigrants, and churches for them. And so, so it's very complicated in that sense. To your first question, to your first part of your question, though, in other words, yes, we should be more diverse. We're never going to be totally integrated, though, because of some of these issues. To the first part of your question, as far as the church and abolitionists, it makes me just think, and I'm not enough historian to say this definitively, but it seems that when you look at the history of race in the United States, what you have is most Christians going along with society. But you also seem to have this outlier, the Quakers, the Gimke sisters, of those. The early abolitionist movement was led by Christians. It was led by Christians. the civil rights movement was led by black Christians. So I'm just wondering whether or not this is a common pattern in society, so one that we can have some shame about, but also have some encouragement about, that, that when it comes to really crafting new paths, that Christians are the ones to do it. And that's why I've hoped that maybe we can craft a new path between all lives and Black Lives Matter. Whereas unfortunately most Christians go with one or the other, maybe some of us can start carving out new paths of communication and healthy interrelations, and finding solutions that can meet, the needs of most people. Because when I look at history, and once again, I don't have enough expertise to say this definitively, but it seems to me constantly throughout our history on race relations, you have most of the church just going along with the racism in society, but that, if you look at the quantity of farms, if you look at all these other groups that set themselves apart from that and are reforming, and eventually society catches up, that is something that gives me some hope that we could effect a change.
Dr. Yancey, thank you so much for your presentation, and I can't help but feel that if our society heard more of the thoughtfulness of your voice and those like you, would be in a whole lot better position. So thank you for your position. I obviously am white, live in a community that is overwhelmingly white, and very frankly, the systemic racism is very hard for me to see and recognize. It's not where I live, and that's probably an unfortunate thing. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more as to what this looks like. So when we do see it, we can recognize what this is. You mentioned inequalities in schools, which, probably the All Lives Matter answer would be, well, school funding is based on property taxes. Property taxes are, socioeconomic, and so is the answer there that we move away from property tax-based education towards a more equitable funding model? I mean, what are some of these institutional perpetrators of systemic racism, and maybe some ways to rethink that? Because probably most of us live in overwhelmingly white communities, and we don't see and understand the depth of the challenges that are there. And could you help open our eyes a little bit to what some of these systemic issues are?
Sure, yeah. And so since you brought up schools, I'll go with that. We know that, we're talking about systemic racism. We're talking about not just contemporary, but also historical effects. So we know that, for example, when it comes to schools, we have neighborhood schools, which means when we have segregated neighborhoods, we're gonna have segregated schools. And when you have a segregated school, then you could treat them differently. And so you mentioned the property tax situation. It is not the case, I believe, that people are saying, well, we're gonna use property taxes because we know this is gonna hurt people of color. I don't think people are doing that. But because the property tax, if you have higher value houses, you have more money you can put in schools. And thus, while it's not a one-to-one relationship, obviously, at a certain point, the resources, you have to have a certain amount of resources, which schools don't tend to get. So when people say we need to change our funding model, due to institutional racism, it's not that they're saying that people are being racist individually. It's saying that we have a system that has gotten that way. All right, to understand that, though, we have to take a step further back and look at these residential segregation. Why are we segregated? All right, one explanation could be, and I think there's something to this, that there's certain racial fears that people have. In fact, I've done research that shows that racial fears drive some of racial segregation. There's research that shows that whites are unwilling to move into neighborhoods, especially of African Americans, if past, I think, 8%. If it's more than 8% black, whites won't move into the neighborhoods, and then it quickly becomes majority black. There's research that shows that when you have predominantly black neighborhoods, you concentrate a lot of the social dysfunction, such as drug use and crime, things of this nature, to create more and more problems. And so it drives the poverty values down even more. And so, so there's that part. There's also a historical part. I don't know if you're familiar with restrictive covenants. That we used to have restrictive covenants in when you bought a house, you had a covenant in there that says you could not sell that house to someone of a different race, or of certain races. We had the federal loan guarantee program, which those of us who bought houses know that having a federal loan lowers the interest rate, which lowers your payment. Most of your houses, until you pay off a certain amount of house, most of your house payments really is interest. And so to afford a house, having a low mortgage guarantee program is very useful. Well, you could not use that program if you were an African American to move into a white neighborhood. That was the rule. That was the law. So it's not just, although there could be some, the reason why we're so segregated is also because we had rules that are not there any longer, but that put people in certain areas, that then segregated them, that then, so now we have these situations where people have start off segregated, and then you oppose all of these dysfunctions, such as the concentration of poverty and such as the unwillingness of whites to move into the neighborhood to really reinforce that segregation, which then lowers the property values. Whereas historically it was racist intent, now you don't have to have racist intent for that to have a pernicious effect. I would also say that segregation impacts people of color in ways other than education. When it comes to getting a loan, a mortgage loan, if your property value has less value, house has less value, that's a problem. There's been some interesting studies showing on how we do our busing systems. So our public busing systems are designed to not make it easy to take a bus from a poor black neighborhood to a white neighborhood to work a job. I lived in Amarillo, which is not a huge city, when I was in high school. It took me an hour and a half to take the bus over to my job at Kentucky Fried Chicken in the white area of town. There wasn't a lot of jobs in my area of town. Now, could I do it? Yes, but that's it's an additional challenge that I now have in order to make money. And so, the thing about structural racism, and I honestly think that here's where the anti-racism people get it wrong when they call it white supremacy, because white supremacy people automatically go, oh, there's a bunch of racists doing this. I think that's the wrong way to approach this. Is there racists out there? Yes. We'll deal with them as they come up. It doesn't require people to be racist for these advantages to accrue themselves. And thus, the end result in the example you're given is that white kids go to schools that better prepare them for college. And then those advantages go on and on and on. And I'll just leave this as a final sort of example of structural racism. And there's others I can give. There's also a wealth gap that we don't always appreciate. That, historically what's happened is whites have had more power, and so they've accumulated wealth. So it's even at the same income levels that people have, blacks and whites have more wealth. Wealth is, the amount of home you own, anything, money outside of your income, capital, that sort of stuff. And that has a big impact, obviously, as far as being able to send your kids off to school, being able, if economic downturn, what happens, that's an historical advantage. Once again, whites with wealth gap, were they racist and they got it? No, but it exists. And so we have to think about how are we going to deal with that. I'm not advocating let's equalize all wealth or anything like that, but just to be aware of that, and maybe we need to talk about what does this mean, and if we appreciate that, then all of a sudden things such as affirmative action don't look so unequal now. If whites have wealth gaps and they can more easily send their kids to college, maybe some sort of programs for affirmative action make it a little bit easier for people of color to send their kids to college. All of a sudden that doesn't look so unfair now. That's the sort of conversations I think we need to have.
All right, let me ask you a political question. if I may.
Sure.
So, and this will be kind of the last question as we're wrapping up on time here. There's a Senator Rand Paul.
I have heard of him.
He has advocated for economic freedom zones in different urban areas across the country. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept, but basically putting like sales tax-free zones in impoverished areas.
Yeah.
What do you think about that as a way of helping certain urban areas to develop and bring about a vehicle of economic activity?
Yeah, off the top of my head, I would not be opposed to that. I'm not opposed to ideas because they come from the right or the left. In fact, I'm a proponent of the voucher system, of school choice. And I think you'll find a lot of African Americans are a proponent of that because we've been sent to cruddy schools. I'm in a church, so I'll say. And so we like to have the choice to send our kids to schools that we think would do our kids right. And so I would be a proponent of a voucher system, and if you're not familiar with that, that means that your parents would get a voucher and they can use that to send you to a school. If there's any difference in the finances, then you have to make up the difference, but it'd make it a lot cheaper for them to send you to a private school or anything like that. I don't know what they do with homeschooling. I don't know what that solution would look like. But you're not trapped into the public school that you're growing up in. I would support that 100%. So yeah, I'm open to all sorts of possible solutions. I'm not locked into any sort of political paradigm that I feel like I have to follow.
Great. All right, let's thank our speaker, Dr. George Yancey.